Welcome to our webinar briefing, the state of the EDDs and CEDS content guidelines updates. I'm Brett Schwartz, an Associate Director at the NADO Research Foundation. This pre-recorded session is being offered through the Economic Development District Community of Practice, led by the NADO Research Foundation with support from the U.S. Economic Development Administration. Today we'll hear about the current status of the growing national network of EDDs, as well as information about the new sections added to the recently updated CEDS content guidelines. I'm looking forward to introducing our speaker, David Ives from EDA, in just a few moments. But first, I want to share a few framing remarks and resources available from the NADO Research Foundation to support EDDs in general, and more specifically with their CEDS planning and implementation efforts. So let's dive into it. So as I mentioned earlier, this session is organized as part of the EDD Community of Practice. The EDD COP is a 5-year effort funded by EDA to provide tools, resources, and networking opportunities for EDD staff to strengthen organizational capacity and better guide regions towards becoming more competitive, resilient, and equitable. So you can learn much more about the EDD COP by visiting the website nado.org/EDDCOP, which houses information about upcoming training and networking events, webinar recordings, resources, best practices, and much more. So back when we launched the EDD COP in October 2022, we reached out to EDD staff to learn more about their needs, interests, and aspirations. We also asked everyone to describe their EDD in 3 words, and the result is the word cloud you see in front of you. It was really encouraging to see some of these words and themes rise to the top. Words like collaborative, regional, innovative, rural, professional, among many others. Now this really speaks to the integral work and services EDDs provide to their regions, from identifying funding opportunities, to writing and administering grants, to collecting and mapping data, to producing community and economic development plans, and much more. But we know it's not always sunshine and rainbows for EDDs, and your organizations often have to navigate challenging waters. So here's some of the other words and themes to emerge from our conversations with EDD staff, and I'm sure most of you can relate to some, if not all, of these challenges. And so the EDD COP is designed to create the space for training, networking, and access to information to help address some of these challenges and better position your EDD in the economic development ecosystem. And we really hope by participating in our offerings, you'll have the opportunity to connect, learn, and be inspired from your peers across the country. So I just want to point to 2 recent resources we've developed that may be of interest to you. The EDDs in Action case study series demonstrates the wide breadth of programs, projects, and initiatives EDDs support and implement to improve their regions, making them more resilient, prosperous, and better prepared for the future. These short case studies show the possibilities for how economic development districts can leverage federal and state funding to support a variety of initiatives across the regions they serve. And we currently have case studies posted on topics related to housing, broadband access, hazard mitigation, redevelopment, food systems, and more. And we'll be continuing to post additional pieces on a frequent basis. I also want to point you in the direction of our brand new interactive EDD map. This map provides information about each EDD service area, its website, contact information, county served, and EDA regional office. It also includes 2 search functions, one that allows a user to quickly identify which EDD serves any address or location, and one to search the map by the name of the economic development district. So we hope this map is useful to you in connecting with peers, but also for the general public or other stakeholders who want to know which EDD serves their area. So this map can easily be linked to or embedded on your own website, so please take a look and share with your networks. And to stay up to date on all of our offerings through the Economic Development District Community of Practice and other news and information in the field of regional economic development, please feel free to sign up on our website for NADO News, which is our free weekly e-newsletter that arrives in your inbox every Thursday. So turning specifically to the CEDS, I want to spotlight 2 big picture themes about the importance and value of the CEDS. The first is that the CEDS should serve as your region's roadmap for regional economic development. And the emphasis is on your region. Yes, there are certain sections and requirements that must be included in all CEDS, but EDA has really empowered regions to take ownership of the process to ensure that this is a locally driven and inclusive effort. Ultimately, it is you and your partners who are tasked with carrying out the strategies and initiatives identified in the CEDS. So it should reflect the vision, goals, and spirit of your region. Economic development is a long and winding journey, and one really with no final destination, but it's valuable to have a roadmap on the way, and the CEDS is just that. The other big theme to think about is the CEDS as a conduit to direct resources to your region. It's of course a requirement for EDDA to access funding opportunities and designation as an economic development district, but it also opens the door to resources from other funders. And over the past few years, in response to the pandemic, many regions have updated their CEDS to include more robust economic resilience and pandemic recovery initiatives, demonstrating that the CEDS continues to be a timely and responsive document to address pressing needs and challenges. A CEDS also signals to philanthropy and private funders or investors that your region has gone through a robust process and has established a vision for economic development and identified key priorities and objectives, making your region more competitive for support. But remember though, this is not just a check the box exercise to get funding. The quality and depth of your CEDS planning process will have an impact on how projects get funded and eventually implemented, as it's an opportunity to convene partners and stakeholders that ultimately will be able to make the projects and initiatives a reality. I also want to point out the CEDS Central website, which is our free clearinghouse for all the resources we've developed over the years to support regional partners planning and implementing their CEDS. We'll continue to be updating CEDS Central as part of the community of practice, so make sure to visit and explore the resources, webinar recordings, research, and much more. And for those of you new to EDDs or working on the CEDS for the very first time, we have a very popular CEDS 101 section designed to get you up to speed on the fundamentals. And also specifically want to call out our Taking the CEDS to the Next Level page of best practices, which shares descriptions and links to strong examples of CEDS from across the country. One of the most frequent questions I often get is, who's doing a good job on their CEDS with, and then fill in the blank. So we have examples of CEDS that have done well incorporating themes such as equity or economic resilience or data and measurement. We also have examples of CEDS with strong design or visual elements, as well as online and digital CEDS options. So check out that page to get some inspiration and ideas as you go through your own process. And of course, reach out at any time if you've got a great example of your own that you'd love to be able to share with the national network. And so be in touch anytime, of course, with questions or feedbacks on the community of practice or our CEDS training resources. It's always great to hear what you're working on. And of course, we love being able to connect you with your peers to share ideas and opportunities. So what you'll hear about more in a moment, we've just reached a key milestone for the National Network of Economic Development Districts. So the time is really right to reflect on where we've been and where we're going with this ever-growing group of organizations. Much has changed in the world and in the field of economic development since the first EDDs were designated over 50 years ago. And in many ways, those changes are reflected in the ongoing content guidelines updates for the comprehensive economic development strategies. Many districts view their CEDS as essentially their strategic plan for their region, and I hope you do as well. It's a process and plan that will help you and your partners meet the demands of the moment, but also be better prepared and position your region for what lies ahead in the future, as uncertain as it may be. So with that, I'm really happy to turn things over to David Ives, who is the Deputy Director of the Performance, Research, and National Technical Assistance Division at the U.S. Economic Development Administration. For many years, Dave has been instrumental in crafting various updates to the CEDS content guidelines and working to ensure that the process and document continues to be valuable and relevant in the current economic climate. He's also been a great partner to us at NADO and is a strong advocate and believer in the mission of economic development districts and the role they play. So excited to turn things over to Dave to share his thoughts and insights on the current state of EDDs and also to discuss the most recent updates to the CEDS content guidelines. So Dave, thanks again for your time and looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Brett, and thanks as always to our good friends at NADO for hosting this webinar. As Brett noted, I'd like to cover two main items today. The first, the state of the EDDs, and second, I want to provide an overview of the recent changes to the CEDS content guidelines. Next slide, please. I want to start today with just reaffirming what is something that's critical to EDA and to economic development at large, which is the importance of EDDs. And I know many of you are familiar with the concept of EDDs, but when we're talking about economic development districts, we're talking about EDA designated and funded organizations that have been formed to undertake regional economic development planning and do a lot of the long-term planning, the road mapping, as Brett mentioned earlier, around economic development for regions. And EDDs in this role are critical to EDA and the work that we do, but they're also vital to regional economic development in general. If you think about it, the relationship and the way that we at EDA talk about the EDDs is really as an institutional partner. The relationships between EDDs and EDAs are all about long-term collaboration. And it's very much woven into the fabric of EDA and foundational to the approach that EDA takes to economic development. The work of the EDDs and the CEDS in particular plays into almost everything that EDA does, from program design all the way through implementation. Just for example, as we in EDA are working on crafting new NOFOs, notice of funding opportunities for different programs, one of the questions that always comes up is, what's the role of the CEDS going to be in this particular program? And what do the EDDs think about how we're approaching this? And then that continues on through all the way to towards the end of the process when we're actually making investment decisions about where EDA money is going to go. One of the key questions that are asked is how do the CEDS align with this proposed project? Does it make sense with the goals and objectives that are currently laid out in the CEDS? So really important to EDA, the EDDs and the role that they play in economic development. But beyond EDA, it's also really important to economic development in general. I mean, for one thing, economic development districts help local community organizations apply for and administer EDA grant funding, which is huge. But what I think their most important role is planning for the building of public sector capacities. And folks have heard me say this before, good economic development starts with good economic development planning. And that's what the EDDs do. And if you think about the role of the public sector in economic development and helping these communities and regions better understand and position their assets so that the private sector can succeed, what the districts do is help plan for that capacity building. And that's critical to economic development in general. Next slide, please. A few words on just the growth and expansion of the EDD portfolio in the last number of years. There are currently 402 designated and active EDDs, and by designated, I mean those that have gone through the official process to receive EDA designation, and active, meaning that they are receiving or they are eligible to receive EDA funding on a regular basis. And we just recently crossed the 400 threshold number of designated and active EDDs in the last few months, which is a major milestone. You know, for the last, I'd say 10 to 15, maybe even 20 years, we've kind of been hovering around, 380, 390, but to get to that 400 number, I think is fantastic and really reinforces the importance of planning and the role of the EDDs in economic development. As part of that portfolio of 402 designated and active EDDs, we have a number of cross-state EDDs. We have a few up in the Pacific Northwest, a few in the central part of the country, a few more in the Mid-Atlantic, the most recent of which, the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, was just added in 2022. So it just goes to show that while the majority of districts are collection of counties within individual states, it really, the cross-state EDDs really get to that heart of the matter, which is the districts representing an economic region, and sometimes those economic regions cross state borders. And finally, wanted to point to this last number of 85%, the number of counties covered by an EDD. So 85% of the counties in the United States are represented by an economic development district. And again, I think that reinforces the importance of economic development planning and regional economic development, again, in general. Next slide. A couple additional words on kind of the growth and expansion of the EDDs. This graphic kind of gives you a good sense of what that growth has looked like since the very beginning, since EDA was founded in the mid-1960s. And obviously, back then and into the 70s, there was a lot of activity, a lot of growth in the EDD portfolio as new EDDs were being added. And then things kind of got fairly steady for the last 30 years or so in terms of the number of new EDDs that were added. But I think what's of particular note is what's happening lately. In fiscal year 2022, we saw 9 new designations, and with roughly a dozen in the pipeline right now, with 5 new designations that have already been made in fiscal year 23, the EDD portfolio is really positioned to have what I think is one of its greatest year or two of growth since the early 1990s. So far this year, we've already seen the designation of our first economic development district in Puerto Rico, which I think is a major milestone. And it may also see our first statewide EDD, or potentially multiple statewide EDDs. So we have that to look forward to as well. Again, I think this expansion throughout the years, and particularly of late, really does speak to the continued growth and the importance of economic development planning and the acknowledged value it brings to the economic development process overall. Next slide. And speaking of value, I wanted to share a few thoughts on the value of being or becoming an economic development district. You know, I often, am asked, and folks will walk up and say, hey, we've gone through the process in our particular region of developing a CEDS, and we're thinking about perhaps becoming an EDD, but we're getting questions from others, from stakeholders, from political leaders, asking really, why should we take that next step and become an EDD and seek that designation? What's the real value in it? So what I've done in the past couple of years is I've put together kind of a list of items that I think speak to the value of being and or becoming a EDD, and wanted to share a few of them with you here, not all of them, but a couple. And the first one is something we've already talked about, which is establishing this long-term partnership with EDD. Yes, you do receive the annual funding if you become an EDD, but it's really that long-term partnership with EDA and all that comes with it that I think is of utmost importance. The next 2 items, number 2 and number 3, really are driven by our regulations. The first one kind of gets to the idea that if you have a project that is in an EDD, but it doesn't meet the if it doesn't meet the eligibility criteria for that particular area where the project's located, but you can show how that project is going to benefit another place in the economic development district that does meet the eligibility criteria, then that project becomes eligible. So it really gives you the opportunity to locate an implementation project outside of a region or geographic area that's facing distress. And when you see the language here about substantial direct benefit, what we're talking about there is things of significant employment. So that would be opportunities for unemployed, underemployed, or low-income residents. And then number 3, the EDD has the privilege of administering implementation projects for low-capacity eligible entities within the boundaries of the EDD on what would normally be a non-competitive basis. So this really speaks to the idea of being able to help the communities within your EDD region that may be really capacity challenged, and it offers an opportunity to provide some assistance that may not otherwise be able to happen. So a couple things from a regulatory side, and then the next 2, numbers 4 and 5 here on the slide, are really about a quick summary of some preliminary findings from some of EDA's key research partners around the districts and the CEDS. The first is from Argonne National Laboratory, one of EDA's partners, from their initial effective framework analysis. And it basically says that areas designated as an EDD were more likely to recover more quickly from the pandemic than areas that did not have this designation. So that's one interesting data point. And the second one is comes from our friends from the Urban Institute with their upcoming EDA geography brief, where they note that there are higher levels of EDA investment inside of EDD areas per capita than areas outside of EDDs. Between 2010 and 2019, more than 78% of EDA grants and 73% of total project investment went to areas covered by an EDD. Per capita, the number of EDA grants and the amount of total project costs invested in EDD areas is more than 3 times the number of grants and investments outside of EDD areas. And I know that was a mouthful, and I read that right off the slide, but I think it's an important set of facts to know. It could be helpful to areas that are considering becoming an EDD and kind of being able to speak to that value to its myriad of stakeholders. Next slide. A little bit here on what's upcoming for the EDDs. You heard Brett already mention the EDD community of practice, which we highly encourage for all EDDs. And that really is intended to create new pathways for regional planning organizations, especially the EDDs, to build relationships and explore new practices for advancing local and regional economic development strategies. Part of the community of practice is about the exchange of innovative ideas. It includes peer-to-peer learning, one-on-one technical assistance for those that are participating in the community of practice, and includes the opportunity and exposure to new research and emerging needs and trends that may be surfacing across the districts. So the community of practice is a great learning and collaboration effort, and again, highly encourage other districts to become involved. Second, a little bit on budget, and 2 kind of key takeaway areas I wanted to mention on the budget side. 1, consistency, and the other, conversions. From a consistency perspective, I just wanted to let everyone know that we've worked really hard at EDA to maintain and to get to a place where the amount of funding that's provided to the districts is consistent across the country. That's one of the things we heard a number of years ago, is that there were some districts that were receiving this amount of funding support and others making this amount. And we've worked really hard to kind of bring, for the most part, consistency across the portfolio. And we're going to continue to do that, hopefully in the future. And then the second concept is this concept of an idea of conversions. 75% of the current designated and active EDDs that are receiving EDA funding are on a 3-year cycle, meaning that they're receiving their EDA funding kind of all upfront for that 3-year period. But however, there's still 25% that are on a 1-year cycle. And what we're going to be doing, and we continue to do, and we do a little bit of this each year, is use any additional funding there may be to move additional districts to that 3-year cycle, A, to better level the financial demand, and B, to limit the administrative burden on EDDs in the tribes. I know everyone would be interested in more EDD funding. We would be interested in providing more EDD funding, but again, we're limited by what is provided to us by Congress. And then finally, on this slide, wanted to cover just a couple new tools and resources. Hopefully you're familiar with them. Both of these are from our partner, Argonne National Lab. The first is the National Economic Resilience Data Explorer, commonly known as NERDI. And this provides information and data on economic distress criteria, impacts from COVID-19, and the existence and emergence of industry clusters. It provides it at the county level, which is fantastic, but it also provides it at the EDD level, which is a particular use, obviously, to the districts. And then the second tool is the Economic Development Capacity Index, the EDCI. And this is a data-driven estimation of economic development capacity, including relative strengths and potential areas for growth or maturation across 5 capacity areas: human capital, infrastructure, financial, industry, institutions, and partnerships. And currently it's just at the county level, but there are plans in the near future to expand that more regionally to include the boundaries around economic development districts. So please be on the lookout for that, likely coming sometime this fall. Next slide. Next, I'd like to pivot to the updates to the CEDS content guidelines. But first wanted to start just with a little bit of background on the guidelines themselves for those that may be new to the concept. The CEDS content guidelines are really EDA's primary policy document. And the intent there is to help regional planning organizations, like the districts, craft more impactful CEDS by kind of laying out what EDA thinks makes a strong, impactful CEDS. The guidelines provide guidance on the required sections of the CEDS, the summary background, the SWOT, the strategic direction and action plan, the evaluation framework, and economic resilience. It does that, but it's really, I think the real strength of the guidelines are the best practices, the case studies, and the links to tools and resources that it provides. And those are located throughout the document in each of the different sections. So highly recommend you check those out as sources of inspiration, either in the development of your CEDS or the update of the CEDS that you might be doing. And it's also important to note that final bullet in particular, that the CEDS content guidelines are a collection of suggestions and recommendations, not a list of additional requirements. The things that you'll find in there are recommended things that you should consider thinking about adding to your CEDS. But again, what goes in the CEDS really should be driven by the needs, the desires, the goals of each individual region, each individual district. So please keep that in mind when you're thinking about the CEDS content guidelines. And more information on the guidelines obviously can be found at the website at the bottom of the page. Next slide. So updates to the CEDS content guidelines. We published new updates at the end of April of this year, really focused in three primary areas. A new section on equity, one on climate resilience, and then an expanded section on workforce development. And the goal with these new sections really get to kind of one of the drivers that I mentioned a little bit about earlier, which is if you are hoping to have more economic development implementation projects focused in a particular area, such as equity or climate resilience, then the place to have that happen or to start that process is really with the CEDS, because planning, as we all know, leads to implementation. So if you're trying to achieve something from an economic development standpoint, really the way to start is by thinking about that as you're planning for economic development. As usual, these new sections are heavy on recommended resources, on pointing to those different tools, examples, links, and much as Brett mentioned it, and I had just mentioned it, I think it's important to say once again that there's a no one-size-fits-all approach to how you may think about these different issues and how you may decide to incorporate them into your CEDS. We don't expect every economic development district to do so, to incorporate these, but those that do, we expect their incorporation to be done differently. Again, based on the needs, the desires, the goals of your particular CEDS and the objectives of your particular region. A couple other things in terms of changes that we recently made to the CEDS content guideline. We updated language on broadband and environmental sustainability. Both of those things can be found in the SWOT section. And we have also removed the section on opportunity zones. Next slide. So first, a little more information on the new sections. We'll start with equity, which is the top priority, both within the new updates that we provided and for EDA. It's our #1 investment priority. So no surprise that would also be our top priority within the new CEDS content guidelines updates. The equity section is focused on the concepts of equity and inclusion informing the content throughout the CEDS. So when you take a look at the section in the CEDS content guidelines on equity, you'll see that we've talked about thinking about equity in each part of your CEDS. So the required parts around the SWOT in the summary background, in the evaluation framework, we talk about how you should think about equity, not only in those sections of the document, but in the process associated with each of those sections. So again, the equity section is structured along the required sections of the CEDS. These guidelines around equity were developed in partnership with the New Growth Innovation Network, Engine. Many of you are familiar with them. And it grew out of a project EDA undertook with Engine and its partners focused on inclusive economic recovery from COVID-19. The team worked with 6 economic development districts to capture insights as they embedded economic inclusion and equitable economic strategies into their CEDS COVID-19 economic recovery plans. So that work really resulted in what you're seeing in the CEDS content guidelines. But what's even more exciting is those initial findings that informed the equity section have now been incorporated and expanded upon in Engine's inclusive recovery guide, which is a toolkit, complete guide, and a full set of recommendation around this concept. And it's located here on the site that on the slide. And it covers equity in the CEDS from both a process and document perspective, which is really important. It includes over 100 inclusive recovery ideas drawn from more than 35 EDDs. The equity section also includes a number of different tools and resources focused on equity and inclusion, and it points to a couple of CEDS that have already taken some steps to fold equity into their CEDS process and document, which again could be used as inspiration if your particular district or region are choosing to incorporate equity in your CEDS. Next slide. Climate resilience. This new section is part of the overarching broader focus on resilience that you know has been in place since 2015, where it's one of the requirements of the CEDS is to have a section, have something in your CEDS that addresses resilience kind of writ large. And we've talked about what that means, and there are a lot of resources that Brett has already mentioned that you can get to talk more about the concept and think about the concept of resilience. But here we're talking specifically about climate resilience, and the development of this section was done really as an acknowledgement that climate continues to be an increasing stressor across the country in every region. And it also is an acknowledgement that it fits really well with the asset-focused regional nature of the CEDS. I mean, if you think about a lot of the issues of climate and the impacts of climate change, those things, you know, aren't limited to a specific small location. They usually are felt in a larger way, in a regional way. And again, that aligns nicely with the regional nature of the CEDS. So the CEDS climate resilience section focuses on assessing how climate change will create new or increased risks, and then trying to figure out what steps to take to better cope with those risks. So we have a recommended approach for those that are thinking about it. And it really focuses first on assessing risks and vulnerabilities. And those, you know, risks and vulnerabilities are primarily focused around natural hazards such as extreme heat, wildfires, drought, sea level rise, inland flooding, things along those lines. Second, prioritizing identified actions based on current assets, you know, and the severity of the risk associated with key exposed economic assets. So really trying to figure out, okay, here are all the assets that I have. Here are the ones that are probably most or at risk of being impacted by climate change. So I may try to prioritize efforts around trying to protect those risks better, trying to protect those assets better from those particular risks. And then three, investigating options to implement, which is really investigating a range of public and private funding and financing that's often needed to be investigated and secured around building climate resilience. And many sources of funding are available for climate resilience planning and implementation, as well as the different options and types that potentially may be available. So it points in a lot of different directions. Again, in the recommended resources section of this particular portion of the CEDS content guidelines, climate resilience, we've offered over 24 tools and resources provided to help with assessing risks, prioritizing actions, and then finding sources of funding to implement. So highly recommend that. And one of the questions we often get too is, you know, again, with climate resilience, this is a big issue. It's a difficult issue. There are lots of moving parts. Where do we start? And taking you back up to under recommended approach, I point to a couple of sites that we don't mention in the guidelines, but I think are really good first places to go to when you're trying to think about how to address climate and the impacts of climate within your CEDS. So NOAA's state climate summaries are fantastic because I think they speak in a really great layperson-like language, really easy terms, and kind of provide a great overview from which deeper analysis can be done. So I highly recommend that, as well as NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. They have a tool that helps figure out how to do a climate vulnerability assessment. So I highly recommend checking that out as well, because that also could be a good place to kind of kickstart your engagement in this particular area. Next slide. And finally, workforce development. As I mentioned before, workforce development was already in the CEDS content guidelines, but it's been expanded into its own section, primarily to acknowledge the important connection between economic development and workforce development. We focus primarily on 3 sections within the workforce development that we call out. The first is key principles. So we're thinking about and wanting those that are thinking about workforce development to ask questions like, are the efforts that we're doing around workforce development, are they employer-led? Do they involve multiple community partners, different types of educational institutions, labor unions, community-based organizations? Are wraparound services included to support the most vulnerable populations in the area? Is childcare and things like that a component of your workforce development strategy? Is the strategy prioritizing proven earn and learn models like registered apprenticeships? Things that things that lead to stackable industry recognized credentials? Are things coordinated across all levels of government, including federal? And then again, finally, how are you specifically linking workforce development to economic development? Specifically within the CEDS, or perhaps by having somebody that's focused on workforce development sitting on your CEDS community, not a CEDS committee, for example. So that's key principles. The next is this concept of sectoral partnerships. And those are really formed, for those that aren't familiar with the concept, by bringing together a critical mass of employers from the same industry who join with other strategic partners to train and place workers into good, high quality jobs. And those strategic partners can include education providers, anyone from K through 12 all the way up to community colleges and universities, community-based organizations, workforce boards, unions, industry associations. There are a host of different players that would be an effective component of any sectoral partnership. And these partnerships are highly effective in building regional resilience by breaking down silos between industry and other key stakeholders, and ensuring that workforce systems, including strong talent pipelines, are developed that meet the needs of that local economy. So thinking about your workforce development strategies from a sectoral partnership is really, really important as well. And then finally, this concept of good jobs, which really reflect a combination of key attributes, which include jobs that have family sustaining benefits, a stable and predictable living wage, transparent promotion or advancement opportunities, and that focus on safe, healthy, and accessible workplaces. So another element that really should be part of any strategy around workforce development. And as I mentioned with the other new sections in the CEDS content guidelines, the recommended resources have a lot of workforce related tools and resources to tap into. And we do include a number of CED examples that have strong workforce development components. Next slide. And finally, just wanted to mention a new tool and resource that has come out since we updated the CEDS content guidelines with the new sections that I just mentioned. This was done by NADO, a great resource. They call it the CEDS Content Guidelines Resource Handbook. You can see the link to it here. And it's an additional set of engagement and funding resources for the new content areas that have been added to the guidelines, and including broadband, and just a wealth of additional materials and places for you all to go to receive inspiration and additional information as you consider the inclusion of these new sections in your CEDS. Here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me at any time with questions about the new CEDS content guidelines. Obviously, your regional points of contact will be able to answer those as well, but if you can't connect for some reason with your regional office points of contact, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to talk through the guidelines with you in more detail as necessary. And with that, I think I will turn it back over to Brett. Thanks, Brett.
Yeah, Dave, thank you so much. As always, really appreciate your insight and expertise on all things CEDS and EDDs, and of course, very grateful for your leadership in this space. So, it probably goes without saying, we're in a very transformational time here for economic development, and it's really exciting to see how EDDs, can really take a leadership role and have that powerful roadmap in the CEDS to drive things forward. So in closing out, again, just want to remind folks to participate in the community of practice. Check out the website, get in touch. We're here, we're excited, we're engaged, and really looking forward to continuing to strengthen this ever-growing national network. Those trend lines that Dave showcased earlier are really encouraging, and so we want to continue to build this network and support all of you and each other. So with that, we'll close out for now. Please stay in touch for future updates and resources available from NADO and EDA, of course. And so until then, be well, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again.